always thought marriage was supposed to be a partnership, a shared life where two people worked together to build something lasting. But over time, the truth started to settle in like a heavy weight on my chest. Our relationship wasn't a partnership anymore. It was me doing all the heavy lifting, and him just existing beside me, quietly detaching from everything that mattered. The man I once loved, the man who promised to be by my side no matter what, had slowly faded away. And I was left, holding on to memories of a love that no longer seemed real. I remember the night it all came crashing down. It was a typical evening. He sat on the couch, eyes glued to the TV, lost in whatever show he was watching. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, as I had done 1,000 times before. I had been feeling increasingly frustrated. There were so many things left unsaid, so many things left undone. The bills were piling up, the house needed attention, and I had to pick up the slack for everything. He was supposed to help, but he rarely did. He didn't notice the mess or the exhaustion in my voice when I asked him to help. And he didn't care. The weight of everything, his neglect, my responsibilities, the emotional distance between us, was suffocating. I had tried to talk to him about it so many times. I had asked him, pleaded with him to listen, to engage. But he just brushed me off or made excuses. And that night, I couldn't take it anymore. My emotions were raw, and I was done pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I can't keep doing this, I said, my voice shaking as I turned to face him. I can't keep carrying this relationship on my own. I'm exhausted, and you don't even notice. You don't even care. He didn't respond at first, his eyes still locked on the screen. His silence, in that moment, was deafening. It made everything worse. My chest tightened as I felt the anger and sadness rise up inside me. I was drowning, and he was standing there, completely oblivious. Do you even care about me anymore? I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them. Because it feels like I'm invisible to you. Like I'm just here, going through the motions, while you've already checked out. Finally, he looked at me, and his expression wasn't one of concern or regret, it was one of frustration, as if I were the problem. You're overreacting. You're always overreacting, he muttered, his tone dismissive. Everything was fine until you started making it into something it's not. Why do you always have to complicate things? Those words, his dismissal, were like a slap in the face. It felt like all the years of love, all the sacrifices I had made, meant nothing. He didn't even see me anymore. He didn't see the woman who had given up so much for their family. He didn't care to understand the toll his indifference had taken on me. I wanted to scream, to make him see, to make him understand the weight of everything I was carrying, but all I could do was shake my head and hold back the tears. I've been carrying this marriage for so long, and I don't think I can do it anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to say, but I knew, deep down, that I was reaching a breaking point. The thought of living in a marriage where I was invisible, unappreciated, and unloved was unbearable. And then, in a moment of utter despair, I said it. I'd never date you again. I can't do this anymore. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and as soon as they left my mouth, I felt a surge of guilt. But there was also a strange relief, as if I had finally spoken the truth I had buried inside for so long. His face froze. The color drained from his cheeks as if I had struck him. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for the first time in what felt like years, he seemed to truly look at me, really look at me. But it wasn't in a loving way. It was a mixture of hurt and confusion. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. Without saying another word, he stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. His anger flared up, but it wasn't anger directed at himself, it was anger at me, for daring to speak the truth he didn't want to hear. You think you can talk to me like that, he snapped. You think you can just throw all of this away? You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. I was drained emotionally and physically. He turned and stormed out of the house, leaving me standing there, stunned and shaking. The door slammed behind him, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't just leaving physically, he had abandoned me emotionally a long time ago. He had checked out, and I had just been too blind to see it. I stood there, numb, feeling the weight of his absence more than ever before. I wanted to cry, to scream, but instead, I just stood in silence. The room felt colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I had said those words, and now I had to live with the consequences. But in my heart, I knew that I couldn't go back. He had abandoned me, and I had finally recognized it. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. He had walked out, leaving nothing behind but an empty house and a heart full of unanswered questions. At first, I was numb, shocked that the words I had spoken in anger had led to his departure. My mind was in a haze, unable to process the weight of it all. How could everything fall apart so quickly? One moment, we were fighting, and the next, he was gone, and I was left to piece together the fragments of a life I thought I knew. I tried to keep myself busy. I threw myself into work, into the mundane tasks of everyday life, hoping that somehow, the routine would drown out the overwhelming silence that had taken over our home. But it didn't work. The silence was deafening. I felt it in the empty spaces around me, in the corners where his presence used to be, and in the spaces between my thoughts, where I couldn't escape the crushing reality of being alone. I started to notice all the little things, the things that had once seemed so insignificant. The way he would leave his shoes by the door, the smell of his cologne lingering in the bathroom, the sound of his voice calling my name when he came home. It was all gone now. And with it, a part of me seemed to vanish too. It felt like I was watching my life through a foggy window, unable to touch anything, unable to feel anything real. The emptiness was suffocating. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. I started to realize that I wasn't just mourning him. I was mourning the woman I used to be, the woman I had forgotten about in the years I spent trying to make everything work. I had become so consumed by the relationship, by the need to make it work, that I had lost sight of myself. I had sacrificed so much, my dreams, my independence, my happiness, all in the name of keeping the peace, of holding everything together. And now, with him gone, I was left with nothing but the raw truth. I had been living for him, not for myself. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of anger rise within me. How could I have let this happen? How had I allowed myself to be swallowed up by a relationship that drained me, that stripped me of my identity? I was angry at him, yes, but more than that, I was angry at myself for staying so long in a marriage that no longer served me. I had been playing the role of the perfect wife, the one who always put her partner's needs first, the one who swallowed her feelings and ignored the cracks in the foundation. But no more. I wasn't that woman anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to take a long, hard look at myself. I began to ask myself questions I had been too afraid to face before. What did I want for my life? Who was I when I wasn't trying to fix everything for everyone else? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no idea. I had spent so much time trying to please him, to be the woman he wanted, that I had lost sight of who I really was. I didn't know what my passions were anymore, what I loved, what I wanted to do with my time. I didn't know who I was without him. But something shifted within me. Slowly, I began to find pieces of myself that had been buried for years. I remembered the things I used to love before the weight of our marriage consumed me. I remembered the thrill of traveling, the joy of reading a good book for hours on end, the satisfaction of cooking meals just for myself. I remembered what it felt like to laugh without pretending, to speak my mind without fear of judgment. And, for the first time in a long time, I started to feel alive again. I reached out to friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. I started reconnecting with the parts of my life that I had pushed aside in favor of my marriage. I enrolled in a yoga class, just for me. I went to therapy, where I finally gave myself permission to be angry, to grieve, to heal. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Every day felt like a small victory, a tiny step toward rediscovering who I was and what I wanted from life. And then, there were the small moments of peace, moments when I was alone, just being with myself. I would sit in my favorite chair, with a cup of tea, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing, I wasn't worried. I was simply existing, and it felt like freedom. It was as if the weight I had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift. But even in the midst of all this growth, there was still a part of me that missed him. It was hard to admit, but I had spent so many years with him that his absence left a gaping hole in my life. I missed the person he had been, the version of him that I had loved. And, in a way, I missed the idea of what we could have been, had we both been willing to fight for it. But that was a fantasy. The reality was that he had walked away, and I had to face that. Through all the pain, I was learning something important. I wasn't alone. Not really. I had myself. I had my friends. I had my life. And, slowly, I was starting to believe that I could be whole again, with or without him. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. And that was enough. It's funny how life has a way of forcing clarity when you least expect it. After weeks of grappling with the fallout of his sudden departure, I was finally starting to find my footing. But there was something I hadn't fully understood yet, something I was blind to in my pursuit of healing. The truth was, I was still waiting for closure, still waiting for some kind of apology, some explanation from him that would make everything feel better, something that would validate the pain I had been through, the pain I was still carrying. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't keep waiting for something that may never come. It was one of those nights, quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after everything has calmed down and you can finally hear your own thoughts. I was sitting on the couch, flicking through a book I had picked up from the shelf. It wasn't a particularly gripping read, but it was enough to distract me from the whirlwind of emotions I had been sorting through for weeks. As I sat there, the glow of the lamp softening the space around me, my mind drifted back to him. I couldn't help it. I thought about the times when we were happy, about the way he used to hold my hand when we walked together, about the laughter we shared in the kitchen while cooking dinner. The memories, like old photos, kept resurfacing in my mind. But then, I remembered something else. Something that shifted everything for me. It was a conversation we had months before everything had fallen apart. I had been upset about something, another argument, another disappointment, and I had asked him, "Do you even care about me anymore?" At the time, he had shrugged it off, dismissing my concern as if it were just another insignificant complaint. But now, in the quiet of my mind, I realized the full weight of what he had said in that moment. "You're overreacting. You always do this. You think everything is about you." The words echoed in my mind with startling clarity. I had heard them before, of course, but I hadn't truly understood what they meant. It wasn't just that he wasn't listening to me, it was that he didn't want to. In his eyes, my feelings were an inconvenience, something to be dismissed rather than understood. The person I had married, the person I had loved, had become someone who couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. I had become invisible to him. And that was the moment everything started to unravel. As I sat there, the realization hit me like a wave. I had been so consumed by the idea of saving our marriage, by the idea of fixing what was broken, that I hadn't recognized the truth, that it wasn't just his neglect or his absence that had hurt me. It was the fact that he had stopped seeing me as a partner, stopped seeing me as someone worthy of his time and attention. I had been clinging to a version of him that no longer existed. And in doing so, I had allowed myself to be diminished, to shrink into someone I barely recognized. It was a painful truth to face, but it was also liberating. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need him to validate my pain anymore. I didn't need him to apologize or explain himself. Because the truth was clear now. I had given everything I had, and he had taken it for granted. But I was more than what he had reduced me to. I was more than the woman who had been abandoned. I was more than the woman who had lost herself trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The more I reflected on it, the more I understood how much I had allowed myself to disappear in the relationship. I had stopped dreaming, stopped pursuing my own passions, stopped prioritizing my own happiness. I had put him first, thinking that if I gave enough of myself, he would come back to me, that he would recognize my worth. But he hadn't. And that was the bitter pill I had to swallow. It wasn't just his fault. I had let it happen. I had let him take everything from me, and I had convinced myself that if I just loved him enough, if I just tried harder, things would change. But they hadn't. And now, I had to face the painful reality that I couldn't change him. I couldn't make him care. But I could change myself. The clarity was like a light shining through the darkness. I had been so focused on fixing what was broken between us, so focused on him, that I had forgotten about me. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for him to come back, for him to realize what he had lost. I wasn't going to waste any more of my time waiting for someone who didn't see me, who didn't appreciate me. I had wasted too many years doing that already. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was going to fight for myself now. I was going to rebuild my life, step by step, piece by piece. I would reclaim the parts of myself that I had lost, and I would make a life that was mine. I had spent so long trying to make everything work for him, but now, I would make it work for me. As I sat there, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for so long began to lift. The anger, the sadness, the guilt, they were still there, but they no longer had the power to define me. I had let go of the need for his approval, his love, his validation. Because, in the end, I was enough. I had always been enough. And now, I was ready to prove it to myself. Time had a way of dulling the edges of the pain, but it didn't erase it. The ache of abandonment, of being left behind, still lingered beneath the surface, like a bruise that wouldn't quite heal. But I had come a long way. I had rebuilt parts of my life, my independence, my confidence, and, most importantly, my sense of self-worth. I was starting to feel like I was in control again, like I could finally move forward, leave the past behind. But life, it seems, had other plans. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when it happened. I was at a local cafe, enjoying a rare moment of solitude. The world outside was bustling, cars honking, people chatting as they walked by, but in that little corner, tucked away with a book and a cup of coffee, I was at peace. Or at least, I was until the door opened with a soft chime, and I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was him. My ex-husband. I froze for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like time stopped, like the whole world fell away, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. He hadn't seen me yet. He was standing by the counter, scanning the menu, looking as unfamiliar as he did familiar. It was surreal. The last time I had seen him, he was walking out the door, leaving me behind without a second glance. And now, here he was, standing in front of me, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't look away. There was so much I wanted to say, so much anger and hurt still inside of me. But instead of confronting him, I stayed rooted to my seat, pretending not to notice him. I didn't know what I was hoping for, or maybe I was hoping for nothing at all. After all, we had both moved on, right? He had his life, and I had mine. We didn't need each other anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. But then, something unexpected happened. He turned, his eyes scanning the cafe, and our gazes met. For a split second, the world seemed to pause again, and in that fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold, indifferent look that had been there when he walked out of my life. He hesitated for a moment, his posture stiff, as if he wasn't sure whether to approach me or not. And then, to my surprise, he walked toward me, slowly, as if the years between us had never happened. His presence felt overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me, and I couldn't decide whether to stand up or stay seated, to confront him or pretend nothing had changed. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Can I sit down?" I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he had left, why he had abandoned me without a second thought. Another part of me just wanted him to go away, to leave me in peace, to keep moving forward without him. But instead, I nodded, my mouth dry, and motioned for him to sit. He sat across from me, his eyes studying my face as if trying to read something there. I couldn't tell what he was looking for, perhaps the woman he had known, or maybe something else entirely. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he was trying to find the right words to say, but he seemed unsure, lost in his own thoughts. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if the years of silence, the years of distance, hung heavy between us. And then, finally, he broke the silence. "I've thought about you," he said quietly, his gaze shifting away from mine. "A lot, actually. I didn't mean for things to end like they did." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, my heart was pounding, but I couldn't find the words. I had spent so long rebuilding my life without him, so long convincing myself that I was better off without him, that hearing him say those words now felt like a punch to the gut. Part of me wanted to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much I had suffered in his absence. But I couldn't find the strength to do it. "I know I screwed up," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I was angry or sad or just numb. A part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the pain and move on, but another part of me couldn't forget the years of neglect, the words he had said that had cut so deep. How could I just forgive him after everything? We sat there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say or do next. And then, unexpectedly, I felt a shift inside me. It wasn't anger or sadness, but a sense of peace in knowing that I had come so far without him, that I had built a life for myself that was mine alone. And in that moment, I realized that his apology, his regret, didn't change anything. I didn't need it. I had already healed, already moved on. And I was okay. "You can't just walk back into my life after everything that's happened," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "I've moved on, and so have you." He looked at me, his face softening, but I saw the same resignation in his eyes. He knew it was too late. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt free. Free from the past, free from him. He nodded, standing up to leave, but not before giving me one last look. A look that said everything, but nothing at all. And then, just like that, he was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty chair across from me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of his absence. I felt lighter than I had in years. Because I realized that the final piece of my healing had come, not from his apology, but from the strength I had found within myself. I didn't need him to complete me anymore. I was whole, on my own. It had been months since that encounter at the cafe. Months since I had seen him, since I had heard his voice or looked into his eyes. Life had gone on, as it always does, and with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further away from the person I had been when he left. It was like I was shedding layers of myself, peeling away the remnants of the woman who had once clung to the hope of his return. And with every layer I discarded, I found a version of me that was stronger, more self-assured, and, surprisingly, more at peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready for it. I was no longer waiting for an apology or validation. I had stopped asking myself what went wrong, stopped wondering if I could have done something differently. The truth was, I had done everything I could. I had loved him fully, given him all that I had, and in the end, it wasn't enough. And that was okay. Because I was enough, and I had learned to love myself in ways I had never thought possible before. One chilly morning, as I was getting ready for work, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I hardly recognized. Not because I looked different, though, in some ways, I did, but because I felt different. My reflection no longer reminded me of the woman who had been abandoned or the one who had waited in vain for someone to notice her pain. Instead, it reflected a woman who had survived, a woman who had come through the other side stronger, more resilient. A woman who was ready to embrace whatever came next, with or without him. It was a strange feeling, knowing that I was finally free. Free from the chains of my past, free from the weight of a relationship that had drained me. But more than that, it was a feeling of excitement for the future. I had spent so many years lost in the shadows of someone else's life, but now, I was stepping into my own light. I wasn't defined by my past or by anyone else's actions. I was writing my own story now. That day, as I walked through the streets, feeling the crisp air on my skin and the hum of the world around me, I realized something that had eluded me for so long. I had been so focused on what had been taken from me, so focused on the heartbreak and the betrayal, that I had forgotten to look at all the things I had gained. I had gained independence, strength, wisdom, and a deep understanding of what it meant to truly love myself. I had learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, how to navigate the world without the crutch of someone else's approval. I had learned how to heal, how to rebuild, how to find peace in the chaos. I smiled to myself, a soft, content smile that came from a place of deep gratitude. For the first time in so long, I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I wasn't even sad. I had come to understand that everything that had happened, painful as it had been, had led me to this moment. It had led me to the woman I had become, and for that, I was grateful. Later that evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, the soft glow of the lamps casting a warm light across the room. I thought about the life I had left behind and the life I was now building. I thought about the friends who had supported me, the family who had stood by me, and the strength I had discovered within myself. I thought about the lessons I had learned about love, about loss, about resilience. And most importantly, I thought about how far I had come. I had always been afraid of being alone, afraid that I wouldn't be able to survive without him, that I wouldn't be enough. But now, I knew better. I was more than enough. I was whole on my own, and I was ready to embrace the future, whatever it held. I was no longer defined by my past or by the man who had left me. I was defined by who I was becoming, and who I was becoming was someone strong, independent, and capable of achieving anything I set my mind to. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, seeing the name of my best friend flashing across it. I smiled and answered, knowing that this was the kind of connection I needed in my life now. The kind of relationships that lifted me up, not drained me. The kind of love that was reciprocal, unconditional, and real. "Hey, how are you?" I asked, my voice light and full of warmth. We talked for a while, laughing and catching up, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel a pang of longing for something I thought I needed. I wasn't waiting for a man to fill the void in my life. I wasn't waiting for him to come back and make everything right. I had learned that the only person who could make things right was me. And I was doing it. As the conversation came to a close, I set the phone down and looked around the room, my heart swelling with gratitude for everything I had. I wasn't looking for closure from him anymore. I had found it within myself. I wasn't waiting for an apology or an explanation. I had forgiven myself, and in doing so, I had freed myself from the past. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. There was a whole world out there, waiting for me, full of possibilities and new beginnings. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure, I was ready for it. I smiled again, this time with a sense of peace that was deep and unshakable. I had made it through the storm, and now I was ready to step into the light. My new life was waiting, and I was finally ready to embrace it.